الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أما بعد. To continue the study of Nukhbatul Fikr of Al-Hafidh ibn Hajr rahimahullah, we'll continue on the topic of a chain that's ali, a isnad that has ulu, meaning that means that a chain has a lesser amount of narrators in relation to a different chain. So let's say you have two chains. One chain has 3 narrators, another chain has 5. The one that has 3 narrators will be called a sanad, a chain that has al-ulu or is ali, that it is a risen chain. Now I could go back to, as some scholars mention, that it could also go back to the sifat of the narrators, the attributes or characteristics of the narrators. For example, if you have in a chain hufadh, scholars of hadith that are known to be memorizers, strong in memory, and their adala and their position is strong, and they're in a chain, then that chain may have more of a precedence than a chain that doesn't have those kind of narrators. Now, as we mentioned last week, that seeking a chain that has al-ulu or is ali is something from the sunnah. Imam Ahmed said seeking the chain that is ali is a sunnah of those who are preceded. And Nawawi rahimahullah, he said, the chain is something specific to this ummah, that the isnad is something specific to this ummah, and a sunnah that is emphasized. Seeking ulu in it is sunnah. For that reason, it is recommended to travel. To seek out this kind of chain, the scholars used to travel different lands to try to seek out a chain which is shorter in number. As it was said to Imam Yahya Ma'in, ماذا تشتهي? What do you desire? He said, بيت خالي وإسناد عالي. A house that is empty and a chain that has lesser individuals in it. Now the most noble forms of ulu is that which is closest to the Prophet ﷺ. When we talk about al-ulu, if you could find a chain that is closest to the Prophet ﷺ, that's the best of them. For example, if we look at Sahih al-Bukhari, and we mentioned this last week, in al-Bukhari, he has chains that range in amount of men that are in it. In al-Bukhari, there's chains that are thulathi. Thulathi means between him and the Prophet ﷺ, there's 3 men in the chain. There's 3 men in the chain. Now you'll find this is the shortest chain Bukhari has, in which between him and the Prophet are 3 men. And there's 22 narrations as such in Sahih Bukhari. So 22 narrations Imam Bukhari reported, in which the chain has between him and the Prophet only 3 men. But he also has the opposite, which is nazil, which has more men in the chain. The most men that Imam Bukhari has in a chain of narration is 9. The most that you'll find in Al-Bukhari of men in the chain of narration in a hadith in Bukhari is 9 men. Between the Prophet ﷺ and Bukhari is 9 men. Most of the narrations on Bukhari are by way of Al-Khumasi, meaning that they have 5 people between him and the Prophet ﷺ. Those are most of the narration of Bukhari. But just showing you here that in the different books of hadith, the amount of men between them and the Prophet differs. So he used to seek out more, they would desire more to have, for example, the 3 men between them and the Prophet ﷺ, instead of the 9 men. But if they could not find except that the narration was authentic by way of 9 men in between, then they would seek that narration out. Now, then he mentions that this kind of ulu can go to an imam or an author. And then he says it is called ulu an-nisbi. Meaning if this lesser amount of narrators goes back to an imam, such as Imam al-Shu'ba rahimahullah and Adnanam, they give us certain types of names, like when you meet with the imam, when you meet with that imam at certain levels. Like let's say if you meet at his sheikh, you relate a report where you and that author both get to the sheikh of that author. They will call this a name like muwafaqa. Or for example, if you to go to the sheikh of the sheikh in the same way in the compile of the hadith, they call it badal. Nonetheless, these are different names of where you would meet with the author or the imam in his chain of narration. Now this in reality, as some of the scholars they mention, in our time, you won't really find this. You only find someone doing this. And also, it is something that, as some of the scholars, from them, Ibn Kathir rahimahullah says, that these sciences trying to meet this author and that author, especially in our time, these sciences are found much in the speech of Khatib al-Baghdadi, and those who tread his path, Al-Hafidh ibn Asakir, authored regarding it volumes. With me, he says, this type is of little benefit in relation to the rest of the types. As long as you can find a chain that is short, and the chain is authentic, then that is what you're looking out for. But to do muwafaqa and badal and musafaha and musawa and other these kind of names that they mention, then this is something which is extra. Now I'll give you an example of what they intended here. That, for example, musawa. Musawa is which to have the number of narrators in the chain, links in the chain from the narrators to the end equals the chain of the one of the compilers. So let's say An-Nasa'i, for example, has 9 narrators in a chain of hadith. Someone later on will come and try to find a narration where he could also meet with Nasa'i by relaying from the Prophet with 9 narrators. And I'll give an example. Suyut rahimahullah, which is from the time of Hafidh ibn Hajr after him, showing us the distance between him and An-Nasa'i. But he says, there are 3 narrations in which between me and the Prophet are 10 men. As Suyuti says, he has 3 narrations, a chains of 3 hadith, in which between him and the Prophet are 10 individuals. Then he says, and An-Nasa'i has a narration in which between him and the Prophet are 10 men. So he says, Musawa lana. This is al-Musawa. This is us equaling him in the amount of narrators in that chain. So as I said, the scholars sought this out to try to get chains which there was ulu in it. They have the less amount of narrators, and they used to love this. The opposite of that al-ulu is called al-nuzul, which is meaning more men in the chain in comparison to another chain. There's more men. So like we mentioned, if there's 9 and there's 3, which one is Ali? The one that has 3. And which is Nazil? The one that has 9 men. The scholars will seek out the one that has 3. Now, Shaykh Muqrah mentioned the way you can identify if the chain is Ali or Nazil is by the amount of men in the chain. So you have 2 chains as we mentioned, and you compare. If this one has lesser, it's Ali. If this one has more, it's Nazil. Another benefit he mentioned is that this is a distinction between authentic narrations. That's important to understand. When we talk about ulu and nuzul or ali and nazil, we're talking about authentic narrations. Because there's no consideration to a weak narration. Let's say you find a weak chain and it's mu'adal, meaning there's 2 narratives missing here and there's inqita' in another place, and it comes from a man like Ratan, as we mentioned last week, where he comes after 600 years and he says in there from the Prophet ﷺ, and he says my chain only has 3 men. We don't accept that from him. That has no benefit to us. It's a weak narration. It's a fabricated narration. When we talk about ulu and nuzul, we're talking about authentic hadith. We're looking for chains of narration where they are authentic and they have lesser men, and the one that has less is called Ali, and the one that has more has called Nazil. Then Al-Hafidh ibn Hajr rahimahullah says, if the narrator is of the same age or level in the chain as the one who he narrates from, then they are called Al-Aqran. Al-Aqran means peers. Like you're a peer of someone. You're at the same age or at the same level. At the same age or at the same level, that is, they're called Aqran. Now, some of the scholars, though they mention it, does not go back to age, but rather goes back to the level of the scholar. The different level he's at in the tabaqah. The different level he's at. Such as Al-Hakim. Al-Hakim, Abu Abdullah Naysaburi rahimahullah, he said that it goes back to the level of the individual. Like say he's at the level of the Sahabi. That's Aqran. If he's at the level of the Tabi'in, they're Aqran. If he's at the level of Atba'u Tabi'in, is Aqran. Like this is what he's intending. He said it does not go back to the affair of age. Now he has a reason for why he mentioned that. Why? Because you'll find sometimes that some of the Sahaba narrate from each other and they're Aqran, but their ages are different. One is older than the other. So for that reason he said that age has nothing to do with it. But nonetheless, the scholars mentioned, so long as it goes to the age and the level of a person, they're called Aqran. Now, after that, he mentions if each of them relate for one another. So you have 2 individuals at the same time, same level or same age, and you narrated from him, and he narrated from you, that's called mudabbaj. That's called mudabbaj. So mudabbaj means a reciprocal narration. So you narrate from me, I narrated from you, that's called mudabbaj. 2 people of the same level and age, they narrate from one another, that's called mudabbaj. For example, if you see from Abu Hurairah and Aisha relate from one another, their narration is called mudabbaj. Because Aisha and Abu Hurairah both relate from one another. They both relate narrations from one another. So their narration is called mudabbaj. For example, you find Malik and Al-Awza'i, they narrate from one another. Their narration is called mudabbaj. Similarly, Ahmed and Ali Madini, and other than them, if they narrate from one another like this, is called mudabbaj. Now, if one side narrated from the other and the other one didn't narrate from the other person, it's called Aqran. So we're going back to the affair of that we're at the same age and level and we're narrating from one another, it's called mudabbaj. Now, this is obviously terminology. But this comes and is important for a reason. Why? Because you can identify by way of this who narrate from one another. So let's say you know that these two narrators are mudabbaj, meaning they narrate from one another, and it happens often. And then another two people, you know that this one narrated from this one, but didn't narrate from that one, they're aqran. If you come to a narration now that shows that this one narrated and this one from this one, but you know he never narrated because they're aqran, they're not mudabbaj, then you know that this narration has some kind of fault in it, and for that reason it shows great importance to try to understand this. Obviously this comes with mumarasa, with practice and looking at different chains of narration, and other than that. Then he says, some type of asanid is where someone lower narrates from someone older. Someone of lower level or younger narrates from someone of greater status and level or someone older. This is called riwayatul asagir anil akabir. A younger or lower level person relaying from someone who's older or greater in status. Now some of us may look down on this. How can someone of lower status relay from someone of greater status? Imam Rahimahullah said, some of them may not be at ease with this. But he said, humbleness is sought. The one who does not want this will be deprived of much good. The one who does not do so. Sometimes the one younger than you and of lesser status than you has knowledge that you don't have. So if you were to say, I'm not going to take from because you're younger than me or lower level than me, you're going to lose a lot of khair. Waqi' ibn Jarrah, rahimahullah, he said, the man will not attain nobility until he narrates from those above him, those equal to him, or those lesser than him. Waqi' ibn Jarrah, from the Imma, the one who said, أشاف شكوت لوكيء سوء حفظي فأرشدني إلى ترك المعاصي فقال إن علم الله نور وإن نور الله لا يؤتى لعاصي. Waqi' ibn Jarrah, this is the one Ashafi said about that. I complained to Waqi' about the bad memory I have. He said, so he directed me to leaving off sins. And he said, indeed, knowledge is the light of Allah, and Allah does not give His light to a sinner. Waqi' ibn Jarrah, he said, the man will not attain nobility until he narrates from those above him, equal to him, or lesser than him. Al-Bukhari rahimahullah reported from those who are considered from his students, such as Abu al-Abbas as-Sarraj, showing us Salaf, they used to do things like this, where they narrate someone younger than him or lesser level than him. Similarly, the Prophet ﷺ did so as well. Anyone know an evidence for that? Where the Prophet narrated it from a Sahabi? Where the Prophet narrated a narration from a Sahabi? Anyone know a narration? Which Sahabi is the one who seen Dajjal? And he narrated to the Prophet ﷺ. Tamim and Aus ad-Dar radiyallahu anhu. He seen the Dajjal, he came to the Prophet ﷺ and informed him. The Prophet during his khutbah relayed a narration from Tamim and Aus ad-Dari. Who's better, Tamim or the Prophet ﷺ? The Prophet ﷺ. Showing us there's no problem with narrating for someone of lesser level than you, or someone who is younger than you, or to take knowledge from someone who is younger than you, or someone of lesser level than you. Someone should not, مَا تَوَاضَعَ أَحَدٌ لِلَّهِ إِلَّا رَفَعَهُ. None humble themselves for the sake of Allah, except that Allah raises them in status. And the narration of Tamim and Aus ad-Dari is in Sahih Muslim. Now the benefit of knowing this is, as Ibn Salah he mentions, Ibn Salah al-Shahrazuri, as we mentioned before, his book Muqaddimah is the best book when it comes to the science of hadith. His book, all of the scholars after him are reliant upon this book of Ibn Salah, called Al-Muqaddimah, and from those who did ikhtisar of it, summarized it, is Al-Hafidh ibn Hajr, similarly Ibn Kathir and other scholars. But he says here, there is an indication upon that the benefit of this is knowing the status of the narrator from the one being relayed from. What is that? Imam Muqbid, to clarify what he means by this, is that one does not think it should be the opposite way. Meaning you come to a narration, you see someone of lesser level relate from someone of greater level, you may say, oh, this may be a mistake. And because you don't know that he did narrate from him, you write off the hadith. That's wrong. But if you know that this individual narrated from someone of lesser level than him, then the benefit is there that you realize that this is not a mistake here. And the opposite is not true. Also, you'll find in the science of hadith, or in the books of men and the chains of narration, that sometimes a father relays from their children. Sometimes a father narrates hadith from his own children. Now that is not as common as the opposite. The opposite is more common, where a child relays a hadith from his father. Also, you'll find that sometimes a person relays an abihi and jaddih, from his father, from his grandfather. This is also, we're going to mention examples for it. As for fathers relaying from their children, then Khatib al-Baghdadi, rahimahullah, he has a book regarding it. Khatib al-Baghdadi, he has a book regarding, as we mentioned, Khatib has a book in every science from the science of hadith. Khatib, as Abu Bakr ibn Naqta said, كل ما جاء بعد الخطيب كل من أنصف يعلم أن من جاء بعد الخطيب عيان على كتبه. Whoever is being just and is just knows that whoever comes after Khatib al-Baghdadi in the science of hadith, he's reliant upon the books of his. He's reliant upon the books of his. He is the Imam, the Hafiz of the East, Al-Mashriq. So he said, he gives a few examples. For example, Abbas, radiallahu anhu, he narrated from his two sons. What are his two sons' names? Al-Abbas and Al-Muttalib. Who are his two sons? One of them is common known, we know him. Who's one of them? Abdullah ibn Abbas. Who's the second one? Fadl ibn Abbas. He had two sons. Al-Abbas had two sons, Abdullah and Al-Fadl. Fadl and Abdullah, Abbas narrated hadith from them. Because Abbas' Islam was later on. Abbas accepted Islam later on. And his children, they gained knowledge. As the Prophet ﷺ said to Abdullah ibn Abbas, Allahumma faqihu fi d-din wa allimhu at-ta'wil. Allah gave him understanding the religion, wa allimhu at-ta'wil, and teach him the explanation. So here we find that a Sahabi is narrating from his two sons. This is the narration of a father relaying from his children. Similarly, later on you'll find also Abu Dawood, Sulaiman ibn Ash'ath as-Sijistani, Allah mercy upon him, relayed from his son, Abu Bakr Abi Dawood. Abu Dawood relayed from his son, Abu Bakr Abi Dawood. Who's Abu Bakr Abi Dawood? What did he write? What's he known for? Ha'iyya. Ibn Abi Dawood is the son of, the one who wrote that is the son of the one who wrote Sunan Abi Dawood. So he relayed from his son, Abu Bakr ibn Abu Dawood. Showing us here another example of a father relaying hadith from his son. As for the child relaying hadith from his father, then that is a lot more common. As for the father relaying a hadith, or the child relaying a hadith from his father, then that is much more common. And that is something that is not hidden. As for narrations where they mention an abihi and jaddih, from his father, from his grandfather, then this is also common. This is also common. For example, the well-known chain, Amr ibn Shu'ayb and abihi and jaddih. Amr ibn Shu'ayb and abihi and jaddih. This chain of narration is Hasan. So if you see this chain of narration, before that it's authentic to Amr ibn Shu'ayb, then you'll find that the narration is authentic. You don't have to look at the rest of it. You just have to look at before Amr ibn Shu'ayb, if the chain is authentic to him. So Amr ibn Shu'ayb and abihi and jaddih. Amr ibn Shu'ayb, so Amr, his father's name is Shu'ayb. His grandfather's name is Muhammad. And Muhammad's father's name is Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, the Sahabi radiallahu anhu. So they say this chain is important to understand because the scholars are different when Amr says an abihi and jaddih. Who is the grandfather here? The scholars, they mention that Amr relayed from his father who is Shu'ayb. The Jad here, the grandfather here, is the grandfather of Shu'ayb, not the grandfather of Amr. That's important. Why? Because if we say it was Amr and Abi, so Amr and Shu'ayb and Muhammad, that narration is not authentic. It's rather mursal because Muhammad never met the Prophet ﷺ. Muhammad never met the Prophet ﷺ. But if we say Amr and Shu'ayb and Abi and Jaddeh, who is Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, then Shu'ayb did meet his grandfather. And for that reason, that narration is authentic because Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As is a Sahabi radiallahu anhu. So here, the narration, as we mentioned again, is a Hasan narration. You should memorize it. Why? Because this you'll find much in the books of Hadith. You'll find it often in the science in the books of Hadith. For example, the takbirat of Eid. To do how many takbirat? You'll find it by way of Amr ibn Shu'ayb and Abihi and Jaddih. You'll find this. So it's important to memorize this narration. Know that it is Hasan. So Amr ibn Shu'ayb and Abihi, meaning Shu'ayb, and Jaddih, meaning Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu. By way of that, the narration is Hasan. Also, you'll find another narration with this as well, which is also famous and is also authentic. Bahz ibn Hakim ibn Muawiyah ibn Hayda. You'll find that he says, Ana abihi and jaddih. So Bahz from Hakim, from Muawiyah ibn Hayda. Muawiyah ibn Hayda, radiallahu anh, is a Sahabi. Many of us may not know him. but he is a Sahabi of the Prophet ﷺ, and his suhbah, his companionship, has been reported by the scholars in many of their books on the companions, such as Al-Isaba of Hafidh ibn Hajr, and other than them, they reported that Muawiyah ibn Hayda is a Sahabi radiallahu anhu. So Bahz and Hakim and Muawiyah. Bahz from his father, Hakim from his father, Muawiyah ibn Hayda. Yahya ibn Ma'in rahimahullah, he said, he was asked about this chain of narration. He said, it is authentic if the one above, Bahz, is trustworthy. So these are two examples of an abihi and jaddih, from his father, from his grandfather. These are narrations which are authentic, showing us that the scholars of hadith paid great concern to all of these forms of narrations for a reason, because it makes knowledge much easier. If you know two narrators narrate from each other and you find them in the chain and they're both trustworthy, then you will say that your research has stopped there. If you know this younger one has relayed from this one who's older and stronger, and you know they're both trustworthy, your research most likely stops there in regards to that part of the chain. So it makes knowledge much easier for you, and also shows that the scholars, they were humble. The scholars, they were humble in regards to this affair of seeking knowledge. They did not have arrogance where they only sought it from those higher than them, but rather they sought it from those who are younger than them, and also those who are lower level than them. So it's important for us to understand that when it comes to the science of hadith, a person has to memorize, number one, he has to memorize these different types of forms of narration. He has to memorize chains and the different men that come in those chains. But he has to do mumarasa. He has to practice a lot. If you're not going to give it time and practice the different affairs of studying chains, and looking at different takhrijat, the different rulings of different narrations from the scholars, then it becomes difficult to understand this science. Because the more you review something, the more it says, كُلُّ مَا كَرَّرْ كَرَّرْ. Every time you repeat something, it becomes firm and strong. So you have to repeat these things, as we mentioned. We'll stop with this much. If there's any quick question, we'll take now. If not, we'll continue next week, inshallah.